Right here where this valley comes out, there's a natural waterway. It's a dry riverbed. That is called a wadi, W-A-D-I. If you went into that wadi, you would find there are rocks all over the place, but they've all been pushed out of the way to make a path.
In early 2025, headlines around the world announced a breakthrough in one of history's most enduring mysteries, the crossing of the Red Sea described in the biblical Exodus. New archaeological discoveries, scientific analyses, and geographical mapping converge to offer compelling evidence for what many have considered merely legend. The Gulf of Aqaba, chariot wheels resting on the seabed, and wind patterns capable of parting waters, these elements form the backbone of what researchers are now calling the most convincing case yet for the historical reality of this ancient crossing. Let's dive into how this mystery may have finally been solved. The story has captivated imaginations for millennia. According to the Book of Exodus, Moses led the Israelites out of Egyptian slavery around 1446 to 1250 BCE, depending on scholarly interpretation. When Pharaoh's army pursued them, they found themselves trapped between the advancing Egyptian forces and a body of water. The biblical text describes how Moses stretched out his hand and God drove back the sea with a strong east wind, creating a path of dry land. The Israelites crossed safely, but when the Egyptians followed, the waters returned, drowning Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen. This account appears in Exodus 14 with verses 21 to 22 stating, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided, and the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left." For thousands of years, this narrative served as a foundational event in Jewish identity, commemorated annually during Passover. It also holds significance in Christian and Islamic traditions, though with varying interpretations. The crossing represents not just divine intervention, but also marks the formal beginning of Israel's journey as a nation, occurring just after their departure from Egypt and before their arrival at Mount Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments. The historical context matters tremendously. The Exodus likely occurred during Egypt's New Kingdom period, 1550 to 1070 BCE, during the reigns of pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, or Rameses II, depending on which chronology one accepts. Egyptian military power was at its height, with chariots representing cutting-edge military technology, the tanks of their day. This explains why finding chariot remains would be so significant. They were high-value military equipment that would only be lost in extraordinary circumstances. What makes the Red Sea crossing particularly intriguing from a historical perspective is that it sits at the intersection of natural phenomena and extraordinary events. The biblical text itself mentions natural mechanisms, a strong east wind blowing all night, while simultaneously describing what appears to be a supernatural outcome. This duality has allowed both religious scholars and scientists to approach the story from different angles, searching for evidence in the geological record, archaeological findings, meteorological patterns, and ancient texts.
And this text contains clear clues concerning the route of Exodus.
Before examining the 2025 discoveries, it's worth understanding the landscape of theories that preceded them. For centuries, scholars, archaeologists, and biblical researchers have proposed various locations for the crossing. The traditional site, popularized by Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 epic The Ten Commandments, places the crossing at the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, the western arm of the Red Sea. This location gained traction partly due to its dramatic visual appeal, deep waters that would require a truly miraculous parting, and its alignment with traditional European interpretations of ancient geography. However, beginning in the 20th century, many scholars began favoring what's known as the Sea of Reeds hypothesis. This theory stems from linguistic analysis suggesting that Yam Suf, the Hebrew term translated as Red Sea, more accurately refers to a reed-filled marsh or lake. Proponents point to the northern Sinai Peninsula, particularly areas like Lake Timsah or the Bitter Lakes near the modern Suez Canal, as potential crossing sites. These shallow bodies of water would be more susceptible to wind-driven recession, potentially matching the biblical description of an east wind driving back the waters. Another significant theory placed the crossing at the Bala Lakes, shallow bodies of water that existed in ancient times but have since disappeared due to the construction of the Suez Canal. Satellite imagery studies conducted in the early 2020s by researchers like Paul and Matthew Backholer attempted to identify ancient waterways in this region, suggesting possible paths through marshlands that could have trapped the Egyptian chariots. By the early 2000s, attention increasingly shifted to the Gulf of Aqaba, the eastern arm of the Red Sea between the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian mainland. This theory gained popularity particularly among those who argued for a southern route of the Exodus through the Sinai Peninsula rather than the northern route along the Mediterranean coast. Advocates for this location, including researcher Ron Wyatt in the 1990s, pointed to a natural underwater land bridge at Nuweiba Beach and claimed to have found chariot wheels and other artifacts on the seabed. Each of these theories has faced criticism. The Gulf of Suez crossing, while dramatically plausible, lacks archaeological evidence. The Sea of Reeds hypothesis, though linguistically persuasive, has been criticized for diminishing the miraculous nature of the event described in Exodus, and the Gulf of Aqaba theory prior to 2025 was often dismissed for relying on evidence that hadn't been verified by mainstream archaeological institutions. What changed in early 2025? A convergence of new discoveries, advanced underwater archaeology techniques, and fresh analysis of existing data led to what many researchers now consider the strongest evidence yet for the historical reality of the Red Sea crossing. The breakthrough centered on the Gulf of Aqaba, specifically near Nuweiba Beach on the Sinai Peninsula's eastern coast. In January 2025, an international team of underwater archaeologists using advanced sonar and remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, documented what appeared to be the remains of ancient Egyptian chariots scattered across the seabed. The discovery, published in the article, "The Archaeological Evidence That Convinces Some Scholars Moses Parted the Red Sea," detailed findings of wheel-shaped structures, axles, and other chariot components preserved in the underwater environment. What made these findings particularly compelling was their arrangement. Rather than appearing in an organized pattern that might suggest deliberate placement or a shipwreck, the chariot components were scattered in a manner consistent with a catastrophic event, as if a military unit had been caught in suddenly returning waters. Dating techniques placed these artifacts within the New Kingdom period of ancient Egypt, 1550 to 1070 BCE, aligning with the broader time frame most scholars associate with the Exodus. The discovery didn't stand alone. It built upon earlier work by researchers who had identified a natural underwater land bridge connecting Nuweiba Beach to the Saudi Arabian shore across the Gulf. This underwater formation rises significantly from the surrounding seabed, creating a pathway that, if exposed, could potentially serve as a crossing point. Bathymetric studies confirm that this land bridge sits approximately 100 to 150 feet below the current sea level, deep enough to normally deter crossing, but potentially exposable under extreme wind conditions. Another crucial element of the 2025 breakthrough came from climatologists and oceanographers who revisited the windset-down theory first proposed in 2010 and expanded in 2014. Using advanced computer modeling based on the specific underwater topography of the Gulf of Aqaba, they demonstrated that sustained easterly winds of approximately 60 miles per hour could potentially displace enough water to expose portions of the underwater land bridge. What's particularly interesting is that the models showed this effect would be most pronounced in exactly the area where the chariot remains were discovered. The publication of these findings in peer-reviewed journals gave them credibility beyond previous claims about the Gulf of Aqaba crossing. The research team included not just biblical archaeologists, but also mainstream oceanographers, materials scientists, and geologists who approached the question from various disciplinary perspectives. Their work was notable for its methodological rigor, with the team explicitly separating the archaeological evidence from its potential biblical interpretation. While the archaeological discoveries grabbed headlines, equally important was the scientific analysis that followed. How could such a crossing have occurred? Was it purely miraculous, or might there be natural mechanisms that align with the biblical account? The wind set-down hypothesis has emerged as the leading scientific explanation. This meteorological phenomenon occurs when strong winds blow across a body of water for an extended period, pushing water away from the windward shore and potentially exposing the seabed. Carl Drew's groundbreaking 2010 study, published in PLOS 1 and revisited in 2025 discussions, demonstrated that winds of approximately 60 miles per hour blowing for 12 hours could create a land bridge about 3 to 4 kilometers wide through shallow waters. What's fascinating about the 2025 analysis is how it adapted this theory to the specific topography of the Gulf of Aqaba. Unlike previous studies that focused on shallow lakes, the new research addressed a more challenging question: could wind set-down work in the deeper waters of the Gulf of Aqaba? Computer modeling using detailed bathymetric data and computational fluid dynamics suggested a qualified yes. While the entire Gulf couldn't be parted, the underwater ridge between Nuweiba and Saudi Arabia could potentially be exposed under extreme but not impossible wind conditions. The modeling also addressed the walls of water described in Exodus. Rather than literal vertical walls, hydrodynamic experts suggested that the Hebrew description might refer to water heaped up on either side of a path, exactly what wind set-down would create. The 2025 papers noted that from the perspective of people walking along an exposed seabed with water displaced to both sides, this would indeed appear as walls of water, especially considering ancient Hebrew has limited terminology for describing such phenomena. Timing played a crucial role in the scientific analysis as well. The biblical account mentions the wind blowing all night, suggesting an event lasting several hours, consistent with the time needed for wind set-down to take effect. The returning waters described in Exodus also align with what happens when such winds cease. Water returns quickly, potentially trapping anyone still on the seabed. Geologists contributing to the 2025 studies also examined seismic activity in the region. The Gulf of Aqaba sits along the Dead Sea Transform Fault System, an active seismic zone. Some researchers propose that tectonic activity might have temporarily altered sea levels or contributed to unusual wind patterns during the period in question. While speculative, this added another potential natural mechanism to explain the extraordinary events described. Climate scientists further noted that the region periodically experiences strong easterly winds, particularly during certain seasons. Historical weather pattern analysis suggested these winds were even more common during the Late Bronze Age, potentially due to different climate conditions in the eastern Mediterranean at that time. The Gulf of Aqaba itself deserves closer examination as the proposed crossing site. This narrow body of water forming the eastern finger of the Red Sea stretches approximately 160 kilometers long and averages about 25 kilometers wide. What makes it particularly relevant to the Red Sea crossing narrative is its unique bathymetry, the underwater topography that would determine whether a crossing was physically possible. At its deepest points, the Gulf plunges to nearly 1,800 meters, about 5,900 feet, clearly too deep for any wind-driven parting.
There were differing opinions concerning the depth of water at the Gulf of Aqaba at this crossing site.
However, the 2025 discoveries focused on a specific underwater ridge extending from Nuweiba Beach toward the Saudi Arabian shore. This natural formation rises to approximately 30 to 45 meters, 100 to 150 feet below the current sea level, creating what researchers call a submarine land bridge. Detailed sonar mapping conducted in early 2025 revealed that this ridge features a relatively gradual slope on both the Egyptian and Saudi sides, with a flatter central section spanning about 10 kilometers. What's particularly interesting is the sediment composition, primarily sand and gravel rather than mud or silt, suggesting a surface that could potentially support foot traffic and wheeled vehicles if exposed.
It's a thin layer of sand or silt. It is easy to walk on it if you take away the water.
Nuweiba Beach itself offers further corroborating evidence. This large flat area on the Sinai Peninsula's eastern coast spans approximately 4 square kilometers, large enough, according to some calculations, to accommodate the sizable group described in Exodus. The beach opens to a natural wadi, valley that could have channeled travelers from the Sinai interior to this precise location, aligning with a potential exodus route from Egypt through the Sinai Peninsula. On the opposite shore in Saudi Arabia, researchers identified another beach area with similar characteristics, creating natural entry and exit points for a potential crossing. Between these points lies the underwater ridge where the chariot wheels and other artifacts were discovered. Marine biologists contributing to the 2025 studies provided insight into how wooden artifacts could survive for approximately 3,500 years underwater. The Gulf of Aqaba features higher salinity than typical seawater, which helps preserve organic materials by deterring certain marine organisms that would otherwise break down wood. Additionally, sections of the underwater ridge experience limited water circulation, creating lower oxygen environments that further slow decomposition. The discovery pattern of artifacts across the ridge also supported the crossing narrative. Rather than being concentrated in a single location, as might be expected from a shipwreck, the chariot components were scattered in a linear pattern across several kilometers, consistent with an army in pursuit formation being suddenly. The chariot wheels and related artifacts discovered in the Gulf of Aqaba didn't exist in isolation. Their significance emerges partly from how they relate to the broader archaeological context of ancient Egypt and the Exodus timeline. The four-spoked chariot wheels found along the underwater ridge match a specific type used by Egyptian military forces during the 18th dynasty, approximately 1550 to 1292 BCE. This design represents an evolution from earlier heavier six-spoked wheels, offering increased speed and maneuverability on the battlefield. Their presence underwater is particularly significant since chariots were high-value military equipment, typically salvaged after battles rather than abandoned. Material analysis of the recovered artifacts, though limited by their condition after millennia underwater, identified wood species consistent with those known to have been used in Egyptian chariot construction. Acacia and tamarisk wood, readily available in ancient Egypt and documented in other preserved chariots, appeared in several of the better preserved components. What's particularly compelling is the absence of certain artifacts. Researchers noted that while chariot components were discovered, they found no human or horse remains. This aligns with the biblical account, which specifically mentions the destruction of chariots and horsemen but doesn't describe recovering bodies which might have been carried away by currents. Dating techniques applied to the wooden artifacts included radiocarbon analysis, where organic material was sufficiently preserved, and contextual dating based on design elements. These consistently place the artifacts within the mid-2nd millennium BCE, aligning with the time period many scholars associate with the Exodus, particularly those who favor the earlier 15th century BCE timeline rather than the later 13th century alternative. The 2025 discoveries also included metal components, primarily bronze fittings and decorative elements that would have adorned the chariots. Metallurgical analysis confirmed their composition as consistent with Egyptian bronze working techniques of the New Kingdom period. Some pieces even retained traces of gold leaf, suggesting these were high-status vehicles, possibly belonging to military officers or nobility, exactly what might be expected in a force led by Pharaoh himself. Comparison with preserved chariots from archaeological sites in Egypt proper, particularly the 6 chariots found in Tutankhamun's tomb and examples from the Museum of Egyptian Antiquities in Cairo, showed strong stylistic similarities. This strengthened the identification of the underwater artifacts as genuine Egyptian military equipment rather than trade goods or later replicas. Beyond the archaeological findings, the 2025 research extensively examined the geographic plausibility of the Gulf of Aqaba crossing within the broader Exodus narrative. Could this location fit within a realistic travel route from Egypt to Mount Sinai and eventually to Canaan? Satellite imagery and GIS, geographic information systems, analysis played crucial roles in reconstructing potential travel routes across the Sinai Peninsula. Researchers identified several wadis, dry riverbeds that become seasonal waterways that could have provided natural travel corridors from Egypt proper to the Gulf of Aqaba, including routes that would funnel travelers directly to the Nuweiba beach area. Of particular interest was the identification of potential sites matching biblical place names mentioned in the Exodus account. For example, some researchers associated the location of Pi Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal Zephon, Exodus 14:2, with specific topographical features near Nuweiba. While these identifications remain tentative, the geographic analysis demonstrated that the Gulf of Aqaba crossing would fit coherently within the itinerary described in Exodus. The research also addressed a long-standing objection to the Gulf of Aqaba theory, namely the significant distance from Egypt's heartland to this crossing point. Using historical movement rates for large groups with livestock approximately 10 to 15 miles per day, researchers calculated that the journey from Goshen in Egypt's Delta region to Nuweiba would take approximately 15 to 20 days. This time frame aligns with the biblical narrative, which mentions several encampments and a non-direct route designed to avoid potential military confrontations along the Mediterranean coast. Another geographic factor supporting the Gulf of Aqaba theory emerged from analysis of the terrain on the Saudi Arabian side. Traditional understandings place Mount Sinai in the Sinai Peninsula, hence its name. However, some scholars have long argued for locations in modern Saudi Arabia, particularly Jabal al-Lawz. The Gulf of Aqaba crossing would place the Israelites directly on a path toward this mountain, which some researchers identify with the biblical Mount Sinai based on features like a blackened peak, potentially from the description of God descending in fire, and boundary markers around its base. Water availability along the proposed route also received attention. Hydrological studies identified ancient springs and water sources that could support a large traveling group, including several that align with water-related incidents described in the biblical account, such as the bitter waters of Marah and the 12 springs of Elim. The 2025 breakthrough relied heavily on cutting-edge technologies that weren't available to earlier researchers investigating the Red Sea crossing. These tools allowed for more precise data collection, better preservation of fragile artifacts, and more sophisticated analysis than previous expeditions. Multi-beam sonar mapping provided unprecedented detail of the underwater ridge between Nuweiba and Saudi Arabia. Unlike older single-beam sonar that captured only points directly beneath a vessel, multi-beam systems created comprehensive three-dimensional models of the seabed. This technology revealed subtle features of the underwater land bridge, including gradual slopes that would have been traversable if exposed. Remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, equipped with high-definition cameras and precision manipulator arms, allowed archaeologists to examine and selectively recover artifacts without the limitations and potential damage associated with human divers. These vehicles, operating at depths up to 150 meters, could remain underwater for extended periods, documenting the precise location and orientation of each discovered artifact before careful recovery. Photogrammetry, the science of making measurements from photographs, enabled researchers to create detailed 3D models of artifacts in situ before recovery. By taking hundreds of overlapping images from different angles, archaeologists generated accurate digital reconstructions of chariot wheels and components as they appeared on the seabed, preserving crucial contextual information. For dating recovered materials, researchers employed a combination of techniques. Traditional radiocarbon dating provided age estimates for the better preserved wooden components. For more degraded samples, accelerator mass spectrometry (AMS) dating, which requires smaller samples than conventional methods, proved invaluable. Where organic materials were too degraded for direct dating, researchers utilized thermoluminescent dating on associated ceramic materials and contextual dating based on design elements. Material analysis benefited from advances in non-destructive testing. X-ray fluorescence (XRF) spectroscopy allowed researchers to determine the elemental composition of metal components without damaging artifacts, while digital microscopy revealed manufacturing techniques and wear patterns consistent with Egyptian craftsmanship of the New Kingdom period. Computer modeling played a crucial role in understanding how the crossing might have occurred. Computational fluid dynamics simulations running on supercomputers modeled how various wind speeds and directions would affect water levels across the underwater ridge. These models incorporated detailed bathymetric data, historical wind patterns, and hydrodynamic principles to demonstrate the plausibility of a wind-driven exposure of the crossing point. If the 2025 discoveries truly represent evidence of the Red Sea crossing, the historical implications extend far beyond confirming a single biblical event. They potentially reshape our understanding of ancient Egyptian history, the emergence of Israel as a nation, and the reliability of ancient texts as historical sources. For Egyptology, the findings raise intriguing questions about a potential military disaster that existing Egyptian records don't mention. This is not necessarily surprising. Egyptian pharaohs typically didn't document defeats, and the loss of a pursuit force in the Red Sea would certainly qualify. However, the timing might help explain certain puzzling gaps in Egyptian records or sudden changes in military campaigns during the relevant period. For biblical archaeology, the discoveries potentially provide a chronological anchor point. If the crossing can be dated with reasonable accuracy based on chariot designs and other artifacts, it could help resolve the long-standing debate between proponents of an early 15th century BCE versus late 13th century BCE Exodus. This, in turn, would affect how scholars interpret archaeological findings throughout the Levant related to Israel's emergence. The research also contributes to ongoing discussions about the historicity of ancient texts. For centuries, scholars have debated how to approach narratives like Exodus, as purely theological constructs, as embellished accounts of historical events, or as relatively accurate histories. The 2025 findings suggest that at least some elements described in Exodus may have historical foundations, even if the text also serves theological and identity-forming purposes. From a methodological perspective, the discoveries highlight the value of interdisciplinary approaches to ancient mysteries. By combining archaeology, oceanography, meteorology, geology, and textual analysis, researchers developed a more comprehensive understanding than any single discipline could provide. For religious communities, particularly Jewish and Christian traditions that venerate the Exodus narrative, the findings offer potential material evidence for an event long accepted on faith. However, many religious scholars and leaders have noted that the scientific explanation of wind set-down doesn't diminish the theological significance of the event. The timing and circumstances could still represent divine intervention working through natural mechanisms. Has the Red Sea crossing mystery truly been solved? The 2025 discoveries undoubtedly provide the strongest evidence yet for the historical reality of this event, particularly at the Gulf of Aqaba location. The combination of chariot remains, underwater topography conducive to crossing, and scientific models demonstrating how wind could temporarily expose this pathway creates a compelling case.